Dr. Campbell, and welcome to the Truth About Weight Loss Summit. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, I'm so excited, Dr. Campbell. When it comes to weight loss, how important is what we eat?
Well, it's the most important thing by a long shot. And you know what I've learned over time, and I've worked with hundreds of people, both in sort of superficial ways, but also in really in-depth, longitudinal ways. I've learned that people target their changes. When you think about weight loss, you think, oh, I have to change X, Y, Z. They target their changes sometimes in suboptimal ways. And so as I've thought about, getting your best nutrition for your best outcomes, I've thought up sort of a framework. It's simple ideas, but it's a framework that I think is very practical and helpful. So let me share my screen and we'll get into this. So I'm going to go over here and then do this. Can you see this okay? So targeting your best nutrition, this is a practical framework. Let me start by talking a little bit about where we are at our baseline. So we have, in this country, this is old news. I don't need to get too much into this, but we have a hugely increasing prevalence of excess weight in the population. We have increasing prevalence of diabetes. And you know what? All this metabolic problems with weight, diabetes, sugar, other issues related to that starts really young. And, in America, 1/3 of American children consume fast food any given day. And over 10% of American children consume at least half or at least 45% of their total daily calories from fast food. Imagine that, at least half from fast food. And here's the thing is that fast food kind of gets a bad rap, food from McDonald's or Burger King. But you know what? I've come to see and believe that food from the school, or Kraft macaroni and cheese cooked at home, it's really not that much better. So, we start really young eating unhealthy foods, and we do this from our young age into adolescence, young adulthood. We're a couple generations into this pattern. We have these habits that are long-standing in terms of how we eat and what we think about how we eat, all those behaviors. And so what ends up being the case is that weight loss is very difficult. When I talk to people, they've usually attempted many things before they have seen me. And at some point, though, when we go through this cycle, people go through cycle with weight loss, at some point they hear about the importance of food. And not just for weight loss, because they've been thinking about that for a while, but I think people also hear about the importance of heart disease risk factors. So they may have been diagnosed with high blood pressure, high cholesterol, or something like that. And they know that food is a key thing to focus on. They maybe have diagnosed heart disease and they know they've heard of Esselstyn and Dr. Ornish, Dr. S, and how food can treat heart disease. They have a new diagnosis of diabetes or blood sugar. You start hearing that food is important for all of these things as we age. So it gets beyond weight loss into some really serious stuff. We hear about food and inflammation, reducing inflammation. And yes, of course, food is involved with losing weight. People have liver problems and fatty liver. That's very, very common, and food can treat that. And then if you have a constellation of all these diagnosed things, you start getting in all these medications. You learn food can maybe reduce your medications and reliances on medicine. Maybe it helps you get more energy, feel better, and even reduce pain if you can achieve some behavioral strategies that work. And suddenly, it's not just about the weight loss. It's really about something much, much bigger, living better, healthier, longer. And at this point is when people end up in my office. And this is a picture from a few years ago at a practice I no longer have. But, this is where I've seen people now for many years, this type of setting. More recently, I have an online group program and consultation at myplantbasedprogram.com. Put a little plug. And now, you see your doctor like this. So you might recognize this is exactly where I'm sitting now. But one of the questions I've asked so many people is, well, what have you tried so far? And you know this, everybody watching knows this, everybody has had these types of experience. You've tried Weight Watchers a couple different times. Maybe you've invested in a structured meal replacement program with shakes and so forth. Maybe you've heard or tried intermittent fasting, just eating, 6 hours a day. There's been a million low carb books that, people have tried low carb versions. And in the past 10 years, there's been a ton of apps and technologies, and people track their calories and all sorts of behaviors online. And as I have talked to so many people, as I've read so much different weight loss research and nutritional research, I've come up with sort of a new framework. And this is not unique to my idea. I think other people have these ideas, but in my own experience, this is what I've kind of settled on: 3 main targets of nutritional change. And these are simple ideas. Nothing here is going to be revolutionary to anybody. But, again, I'll start out with what I originally said. When I see people and they're working on weight loss and they've been doing it for decades, I see people who oftentimes are targeting the wrong, the less optimal things. They're not putting their efforts where they should. And so it leads me to think that this framework may be useful for you, your listeners. These are the 3 factors that I think are critical, the 3 buckets. There's food choice, food amount, and eating structure. And let me talk through each of these. Let me start by giving you some examples of how, popular programs actually use these. And let me also mention before I even do that, these 3 factors, food choice, food amount, and eating structure, are highly interrelated. We tend to think of these things as, just general nutrition behaviors, but they are distinct. They are distinct in terms of our behaviors and how we change, but they are, it is true also, of course, they're interrelated. If you choose certain foods, it's going to affect how much food you eat or how little food you eat. How much food you eat or how little food you eat affects when you eat, snacks and meals and so forth. And all these things are interrelated, but slightly different targets. So let's look at some typical things. There's, everybody has seen these typical types of programs. These are obviously just a tiny smattering of options out there, but let's look, for example, at Nutrisystem, meal replacement, or Weight Watchers, or Noom, which is basically calorie counting. I would argue that these types of approaches are the most prevalent weight loss strategies in the US over the past 50 years. This is sort of the typical diet industry approach. And it's focused mostly on food amount. At the extreme, these programs sort of advertise and sell this idea that you can eat anything you want to. You don't really need to fully change your food choice. It's really about food amount. It's just everything in moderation. No food is off limits. And that's kind of a nice sell. It's an easy sell because you don't really need to change your most favorite things. This little blue thing here is a screen grab from a popular website. It says, they come out right out and say, is this food worth it? It's all things in moderation. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. The important thing is making a decision that's right for you. And look, I've actually run low calorie types of programs like this meal replacement program. So I'm not totally averse. And sometimes these things work for people, but it is really focused on just eating less. This is another example from Noom, the Noom Twitter account. Just as I was putting this together, I happened to see pop up on Twitter this post: the smell everyone dreams of waking up to, the side dish that steals the show, the sliver of salty, proteiny deliciousness. Yep, today we're talking about bacon. What's your favorite type of bacon? Turkey, slab, or Canadian? And this is the weight loss. This is the weight loss effort, the weight loss program. So it's very clear when they're selling these things, they're selling, eat whatever you want to. We're just going to tell you how to be reasonable. And boy, that sounds so reasonable. And then there's other approaches where it's just entirely food choice. So we've all heard about the low carb things, the Atkins diet, the keto diet. And of course, this also applies to whole food, plant-based, or vegan. And a lot of times these messages are paired with, eat as much as you want to. Eat until eat when eat whenever you want to, eat as much as you want to. I've said things like that in certain situations, and it's really entirely about food choice. And then you have things like intermittent fasting, and this is a most typical example of eating structure approach. This is basically, if you look at the research on intermittent fasting, what they do is they do very structured times that you can eat, and there's all sorts of different protocols, alternate day fasting, time restricted eating, where you can eat only a 6-hour window or 8-hour window and so forth. And a lot of these research studies go to great pains to say, we do not tell people any nutritional advice. So we don't tell them what to eat, basically. They're not doing any necessarily any portion restriction or anything like that. It's only when they eat. That's the approach. So that's a very clear example of eating structure. And as much as these various approaches kind of focus on one takeaway, what I have learned as I've looked at, a million food diaries and I've worked with people, is that you will not get your maximum result unless all three of these things are firing in the right way. And, again, these are not this isn't rocket science, but people should think about their own behaviors in these three things. So let me talk a little bit about each one of these things and sort of how you would target each one of these things. Food choice is the foundation. It is the most important thing of these three factors. And within food choice regarding weight loss, this is the most important idea. And I know, Chef AJ, you've been talking about this for years, way ahead of the curve in terms of getting this conversation out there. And everybody's sort of talking about this. It's calorie density, calories per given weight or volume of food. And again, it's not a complicated concept, but it is really foundational to food choice. And just to get into the weeds a little bit here, if we break down foods into certain food groups, we know non-starchy vegetables are very low calorie. All the greens and the side vegetables are very low calories per pound. I tell people you would have to eat like a horse if you wanted to get enough calories just from non-starchy vegetables. You'd have to wake up and start eating and eat until you go to bed. Fruits have a little bit more calories, but not that much more. This is whole, fresh fruits. Healthy cooked starches, the beans, the potatoes, the sweet corn, the whole grains, cooked whole grains. These have a little bit more calories, a little bit more energy to fill you up. So a pound of rice and beans, for example, is going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 500 calories or so. And assuming you're not adding, fats or sugars. And then we start processing foods a little bit. So we have dried fruits, sugars, or what I call dried grains. These are basically flour products that are baked, the breads, crackers, cereals, and these are definitely more calories per pound, which means they're more calories per bite, significantly more calories per bite. I should mention here, this does not mean they're bad foods or good foods or healthy food, or even healthy foods or unhealthy foods. I think these things can be healthy and part of a healthy diet. But for weight loss, realize you're getting a lot more calories per bite when you go up here in this direction. And then you have nuts, same thing. Research shows that nuts are associated with good outcomes in certain health conditions. So they're not, I wouldn't say they're unhealthy, but boy, there's a lot of calories per bite. And then you have oils at 4,000 calories per pound. Now, some people who are new to plant-based, I talk about new plant-based, you notice I just put plants up here, but some people are interested in the animal foods. And so I put those on here as well, just for sake of completeness. If you're looking at animal foods, with the exception of liquid dairy, which is mostly water, you're looking at most animal foods are somewhere in this ballpark, 500, 600, 700 calories to 2,000 calories per pound. So we kind of put this all together. Now, this is all kind of a simple idea, but here's the thing about it, is that to lose weight, you need to consume fewer calories. As I'll tell you about, I'm not really into counting calories for the rest of your life. I think that's a bad approach. But It doesn't change the biology that you'll need to consume fewer calories. Okay, that's kind of the biology of it. So how do we consume fewer calories? If you consume foods on the left part of this graph, you will feel full on fewer calories. I'm sure people have heard this a lot of different times in a lot of different ways. But it's been studied. There's human intervention research showing in single meal studies, in 12-week studies, in 1-year studies, that people who consume food more down here end up consuming fewer calories and still being full. And so, and there's different ways we study it. We can ask people, are you full? And rate your satiation and do questionnaires and so forth. We can also measure things like ghrelin. Ghrelin is a hormone that causes hunger. It's made by the stomach. So we can actually measure ghrelin levels in the body. And you can do these studies where you feed people different meals of different calorie densities, or you give them different calorie dense diets over 12 weeks or a year. And you can see that ghrelin, the hunger hormone, is lower when the energy density of the diet is lower. So I think one of the greatest barriers to long-term weight loss is hunger. It's almost impossible to be chronically hungry. And so making the food choices down to the left of this chart, and I put the line here, I know most people in the plant-based world do as well, that staying to the left of this leads to being able to eat food to be more fullness with less calorie intake. It ends up being a fairly simple idea, but gosh, people when they're new to this, they have a lot of confusion about potatoes and rices and fruits and so forth. So it's important to realize how these things kind of fit together. The next item I want to talk a little bit more in depth is food amount. And as I mentioned before, food amount is the principal way that people have thought about weight loss for, 50 years plus. We've heard this message a million times: eat less, exercise more. It's just as simple as that: eat less and exercise more. But as I mentioned just a moment ago, if you're chronically hungry, it's virtually impossible to continue a state of chronic hunger for the rest of your life. So eating less in the face of hunger generally doesn't work. And studies confirm that. So if you look at reviews where they've looked at large numbers of calorie restriction studies, and people who have done even sort of the gold standard supported meal replacement, low calorie types of programs, and you follow them out over time, 75% of people, people on average lose 75% of their weight. I'm sorry, I keep saying this the wrong way. People on average regain 75% of their weight within 5 years after doing these low calorie restriction programs. So it's a testament to how hard it is for you to continue a state of chronic hunger. It's very, very hard. And furthermore, if you just focus on food amount, if that's your singular focus, eat less, count calories, I'm going to get less than 1,200 calories, period. That's it. I'll eat anything, but it's going to be less than 1,200 calories, or a point system or whatever. If that's your singular focus and that's all you're focusing on, and you're still eating the same types of rich foods that you love, it's very hard, because if they did a very interesting study where they fed people a very high fat, rich breakfast that was a certain number of calories, and it was very small. It's a small little breakfast. And then they measured how many calories they ate throughout the day. They came back and then they fed them a breakfast that was high in fiber, low in fat, high in carbohydrate, low in calorie density. It was much bigger and bulkier. Subjects said that the bulkier breakfast was more filling, and the high fat breakfast, it was tasty, but it was not filling. So what did they do? They had the very rich breakfast, and you know what? They were still a little bit hungry. So they went home from the testing center, and they had a mid-morning snack that was a little more calories. They had lunch, and they had a bigger lunch because they were still a little bit hungry, even though they had the same number of calories from that high calorie thing. So, this idea of just eating less without changing your food choice is a losing proposition. And we also know, of course, that very rich foods high in sugar and fat have addictive properties. So these are foods that play on our pleasure pathways that we want more and more and more and more and more. So it's very hard to eat less and exercise more in a vacuum. And I think that's a poor sort of solo strategy. Now, does this mean on a plant-based diet, you may have heard this, is this a free pass to eat as much as you want? I haven't always been so careful about how I talk about this, eat as much as you want. And now I know to be a little more careful. I normally say things like, eat until you're comfortably full. Comfortably full. Well, I've worked with enough people to know, well, what the heck does that mean? Because in America, if we've been overeating at most meals, on most days, on most years, and most decades of our life, every single day, you can imagine that our sense of hunger and fullness is a little out of whack. And, we don't eat in this country purely out of hunger and satisfy purely out of hunger. So this idea of eating until you're comfortably full can be a really devilishly kind of difficult thing to pin down. And, and Americans have, I think, a long history of overeating, but, through 3% of Americans are have full-on binge eating disorder. And I think a much larger percentage of Americans have an elements of overeating with some loss of control when they eat that lead to overeating. And so it's certainly not a stretch to think that you can eat a plant-based diet but not get the maximum benefit, because maybe you are overeating some of these things. So there's a couple of things that I sometimes pull out of my hat when I'm coaching people and working with people closely. In some very specific circumstances, I will work with people to track calorie intake. And it's just an educational experiment to sort of see, where are you getting your calories? Because I can't be with people at all times of every day. And if people are diligently tracking things, they realize, oh my gosh, that handful of the healthy cereal is like 200 calories or, whatever. My gosh, I had that healthy popcorn sitting in front of the TV. That's supposed to be okay, but my God, that's a lot of calories. So this can be very illuminating to see where the energy is coming in, and particularly when you pair it with the idea of hunger. Is the calories you're bringing in, are you eating those out of hunger or not? So this can be a very useful, very short-term kind of coaching technique or information you can use to tweak your diet. The other thing is to go back to food choice. And you can basically essentially restrict food choice to such a degree that you eliminate pleasure and interest from eating, the heightened pleasure and interest from eating. So this may sound a little painful. Some people find that they really could enjoy this type of approach. And you're basically getting to a point where you're eating really for hunger. And when you're eating purely for hunger, it can be a very powerful lesson to understand what do you actually want to eat to be full, and how long does that last you? Let me give you an example. So Mary McDougall has something called Mary's Menu, and I know other people, even before I heard of Mary McDougall's program, had done, you've heard of some of these anecdotes of people eating just potatoes and nothing else and that type of thing. And but one strategy is to do like a mono starch, this kind of Mary's Menu or the McDougall diet approach for that specific weight loss thing, Mary's Menu. I think that's what it's called. And the rule is you pick one starch. It could be potatoes, it could be oatmeal, cooked oatmeal, or one other starch. And other than that, you can only have vegetables. And you could have, there's variation in how some people do this, but you could, I think to start, you can have fruits, fresh whole fruits or fresh or frozen whole fruits. And that's all. So you're literally getting your energy from one starch, and you could do it for a couple weeks. And so if you're eating oatmeal 3 times a day for 14 days in a row, by day 10, it's not so interesting. Okay. You're only going to eat as much as you need to be full. And you're not going to eat it again until you're hungry. Okay. You're basically taking the pleasure out of the equation. And I've done this just out of curiosity for a couple of weeks. And what you find is that you may find that you actually eat less than you would imagine than you used to. And boy, that's an interesting lesson, because if you actually need less than what you were eating, there may be an element of how much you were eating that was for pleasure or, not for hunger. And so it just can add a little education and add a target to get in your maximum results, maximum benefit. Finally, I'll talk briefly about eating structure. I've looked at so many food diaries, and I see this pattern a million different times. For breakfast, I wasn't very hungry, so I didn't eat anything. I'm rushing out the door, getting the kids ready, whatever. But I did have some coffee. I need my coffee. And, lunch, I was still really busy. But I have a snack. I take a granola bar or some crackers or maybe a diet drink or diet shake or something, and I have the meal replacement shake. And then lunch comes around, and I'm starting to get a little bit hungry, usually around afternoon, and I'll go down and get a snack, and it'll be a chips or a sweet snack or something. And then dinner, the hunger, and now I'm starting to feel really hungry, and I'll have a large, typical rich meal, burgers or pizza or whatever, some sort of meat, processed starch, white flour, cheese, some added fat, some sugars, and then if you're conscious and you don't want to eat too much of that, you might still be a tiny bit hungry after dinner, and you're sitting down after relaxing after everything's done, and you get some microwave popcorn or some brownies or a Christmas cookie or a bar of chocolate. I mean, I've seen this type of pattern a million different times. This is very, very typical. And so eating structure is related to that's this idea of when you eat and how you structure your intake in terms of meals versus snacks and how big your meals are and so forth. And it's important. It's important. 20% of Americans regularly skip breakfast. So skipping breakfast is very common. And then on the flip side, if you eat late into the night, people who have late night eating oftentimes have also poor metabolic health. So, this eating structure has been studied. It's been associated with bad outcomes. And it's also true in kids. Kids, we know, for example, kids are healthier if they have more structured mealtimes, family mealtimes. Snacking is a big item of study. We know snacking is very, very common. It's actually becoming more common in the American population. In children's diets, snacking provides almost 30% of the total calorie intake. So it's all important. Snacking, just to stay on that for a moment, snacking is not inherently good or bad, in my opinion. It really depends on what you're snacking on. If you're snacking on healthier stuff, it can be okay. But I will say, in a busy American life, the temptation for snack foods is to get something that's processed and higher calorie density. It's very hard to just eat baby carrots if you're eating a lot of calories from your snacking. So I'm not a huge fan of snacking just because it lends itself to poor food choice, but the snacking itself is not inherently bad if you want to eat healthy snacks. So as a result of some of this research and looking at timing of eating, there's been, this very popular idea of intermittent fasting. And I mentioned before some of the protocols. There's been studies on alternate day fasting where it's very low intake for one day. The next day you can eat whatever you want to. There's protocols where you eat very low calorie, basically fast for 5 days in a row every month. There's protocols where there is time restricted eating. So you're only eating, and everybody's heard of this by now, you're only eating 6 hours a day or 8 hours a day or something like that. And this is very appealing because, again, people oftentimes focus on this strategy to the exclusion of the other parts of this practical framework I'm giving you. If you just focus on intermittent fasting, I don't like it very much, because studies show that the dropout rate from just intermittent fasting is very high. They can be high as 40% of the subjects who are asked to do this stop doing it. And that suggests to me that, again, this idea of chronically being hungry at a regular interval in your life is very uncomfortable. It sounds appealing in some way. You can just deal with a few hours of being hungry, but then, gosh, the next day I can have cheesecake for lunch and brownies for my afternoon snack, and there's no restrictions on food choice. It sounds lovely. It sounds easy. Doesn't work much better than just continuously trying to restrict your intake, and that chronic hunger becomes kind of unbearable. Again, what I'm saying is the singular focus on this is not successful, but it is important. I've seen so many people with very unhealthy eating structures, and they can eat the right foods, and eating the right foods is actually going to kind of help them work out their eating structure a little bit. But if they don't address some of the patterns that they've had their entire life of eating maybe very irregularly, allowing large stretches of time, for example, before meals, where people have regular bouts of really pretty, suddenly it's like they're ravenous. If they don't address habits of snacking, if they, some people, they get so many of their calories from snacking that there's just a pattern of having food around them all the time and mindlessly eating snacks. These are all what I call eating structure aspects. And again, if you don't eat, you can choose plant-based diet, whole food plant-based diet, but if you're struggling with these things, you are not going to get your maximum results. So it's worth thinking about and targeting some of these things. So in summary, these, as I mentioned at the outset, these are not complicated ideas: food choice, food amount, and eating structure, but I think they encapsulate the most common approaches to weight loss. And if you think about, if the viewer here thinks about their own aspect of each of these things, okay, well, am I choosing the right food, particularly with regard to calorie density? Do I need to think about how much I'm eating? Is that something that maybe I should explore? And, am I struggling with eating regularly or allowing regular hunger into my life? And eating structure, this begins to tell, this is basically what I do when I sit for an hour with people and I talk through their history and their food diary and so forth. I think about each of these things and think about, okay, well, what's the target? What's the most efficient, effective target for you to work on? And I put a little star here for food choice. Food choice is the foundation. You are going to have a terrible time getting these other things right if you don't have the right food choice. Food choice is going to make these other ones much easier. If you have the wrong food choice, you're going to be fighting biology to make these other things right. So definitely the foundation is food choice. But I've done this long enough to know that it's not just a matter of making healthy choices and everything falls into place for everybody. That's not the case. A lot of people need to work on some of these other things as well. So, if you allow me a brief little plug here in my presentation, I do see people for medical visits in New York and Florida, and I have a group program online, a very small group program where I coach and see people and work at this website. So that's my, kind of simple. I should mention too, my framework. This framework, I first gave a presentation on this a couple of years ago, and I was like, "Oh my God, this is how it all fits together." And I patted myself on the back. Like, this is good. I come up with this. I'm coming out with a journal article soon will be out with this kind of framework and some of my thoughts and rationale. But you know what? I've seen other people. None of these ideas are original, and even putting them together like this is not terribly original. Other people have had these ideas, of course, but it is, I think, a very useful way to kind of break down what you're currently doing and what you might need to do to get your best results. So that brings me to the end, and I'll certainly answer if you have any questions, Chef.
Well, I like you say, they may not be new concepts, but I think the way you presented it was really very interesting and a new way to think about it. Like you say, a framework, because I think too many people focus on just the food amount and they never really get the food right.
Yeah, that's super common. Like I said, that's been the mainstay of dieting experience in America for 40, 50 plus years. It's just eating less. And so people oftentimes focus on that. I think probably way too much. That's not the tip of the spear, so to speak.
Right. So if I understand you, if we were to eat a diet that was designed to get us healthy, it might also help us with weight loss.
Oh, yes. If you think about food choice, people have asked me this. I'm interested in cancer. I'm interested in heart disease. I'm interested in weight loss. And they ask what foods are good for XYZ. The simple answer is that for almost everything, the same food choice helps. And, it's wonderful in a way. I mean, that means that if you're working on something for your heart health, you're also going to help with your weight loss. I will say there's one exception in my clinical experience, and that's with gut symptoms and gut health. Sometimes there are very specific kind of odd things with gut symptoms and gut health that do kind of range a little bit different.
Right. So a lot of times these programs that have people weigh and measure their food, they exclude some unhealthy things like sugar and flour, but they allow other things that we don't think are optimal, like oils and animal products. But can a person really sustain a strict weighing and measuring program for the rest of their life?
Yeah, Weight Watchers, for example, is sort of a game around the same idea. You can count your points every day or throughout the week, and if you game the system, you keep your points low enough, you can go to Cheesecake Factory and have the meal that you've been wanting, right? And you're starving all day so that you can save your points up for later. And everybody's familiar with that idea of counting calories and eating less. But what I've found is that the people, for some people those types of programs have resulted in long-standing weight loss and long-standing benefit. I don't want to discount that. There are a real percentage of people that have long-standing benefit. However, it's not most people. Most people kind of struggle, and it's because of this idea of food choice. It's very hard to be hungry for the rest of your life.
Absolutely. Well, this idea of moderation, our friend Dr. Esselstyn will even say moderation kills, but how do you feel about that, Dr. Campbell?
There's a very interesting study that looked what does moderation mean to most people? And so they did this very interesting study where they brought people in and they put in front of them a whole pile of gummy bears, or in another study it was some other junky food. Everybody knows you shouldn't gorge yourself on gummy bears or whatever. Everybody knows that. There's no confusion about that. And they asked them, okay, what should you eat? What would be a moderate amount of consumption, and what would be excessive to eat? And what they found was that people who are sitting in front of a plate of junk decided that a moderate amount was usually, if you averaged out all the results and so forth, that moderate amount was usually a little bit more than they would like to eat. So this idea of moderation actually just means, to most people in a practical sense, it means whatever I want and a little bit extra. So I can be good and in my brain, feel good about what I'm doing, and I'm still practicing moderation. And the conclusion was that moderation not only is not helpful, but it may be harmful in people's efforts. So I'm I'm strongly against that idea of moderation.
So therefore, like a cheat day, you would say probably for somebody on a weight reducing program is not the best idea.
Yeah, no, it's not. I don't think it's the best idea. I have had some individuals who can get away with it. They have never eaten this way, and they insist once every 3 months they need to have they go out and have their steak dinner or whatever. And I say, oh God, I don't know. You're playing with fire, because most people that's going to be a slippery slope. And you know what? Some personalities, they actually do it. I have guys followed up with me for years and had just about every magical, wonderful benefit you can imagine from eating a healthy diet. And he still goes once every 3 months. But I would say the people who can get away with that's a small percentage of people in my experience, a very small percentage.
Right. Because maybe people vary in the degree of how susceptible they are to the pleasure trap.
You're exactly right. Yeah. Exactly right.
When you say eaten this way, let's just be clear. What is this way? Like, what way of eating do you recommend to your patients as a doctor, even if they don't want to lose weight?
So, whole food plant-based diet is the general kind of standard I recommend. It's a diet of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, potatoes, and beans or legumes. And in the beginning, when first people, I don't encourage people to do portion restriction at all. In fact, they usually have to eat more food because of this calorie density idea to be good and full and satisfied. So it's a whole food plant-based diet, without added oils, without added sugars or animal foods.
Do you find, Dr. Campbell, that this process of weight loss and weight maintenance are distinctly different?
I do not. There's some research on exercise suggesting, for example, that exercise is not great for weight loss, but is helpful for weight maintenance. I don't fully understand why there's a distinction, but in general, for dietary research, I think the same thing that works in phase 1 is the same thing that works in phase 2, the maintenance. It's pretty clear to me that these principles apply to both aspects.
Why do you think it is that so many people go on a diet and lose weight, not only gain the weight back, but then they actually gain more weight back? It seems like that for some people, they might be better off never having gone on a diet.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, there's a million reasons why people fall off the wagon, right? There's the biological reason that's most common, I think, is chronic hunger is intolerable. But there's also a ton of social reasons. I mean, people who are trying to do a healthier diet, we live in an environment that is pulling us in the wrong direction every darn time we turn around. So, the food, you watch TV, it's got junk food, eat, this restaurant food, this soda drink, whatever, the emotions, the food. If you live if you have a household where people are eating different foods and different dietary patterns, you've got that stuff right in front of you all the time. So there's a lot of reasons for people to struggle, because we're struggling against a pervasive environment that's pulling us in the wrong direction. Sometimes it's biological, but like I mentioned, sometimes it's chronic hunger and that biologic drive just to eat richer food. But a lot of times also it's just that environmental influence of having junk around all the time.
So how important is that for people that are struggling with weight or even struggling to maintain their weight to have a clean environment?
It's supremely important. Once you have these targets, if you think about your nutritional behaviors and you target what you need to do, you must structure your environment to make that the easy choice and the convenient choice, and get temptation out of your environment. It's crucial. It is absolutely crucial. Again, it's one of those things where once in a while, I'll have someone who has some long-term success despite having junk in front of them, but that's really rare. I mean, that's the exception rather than the rule. So the environment's crucial. And that's where I think it's really difficult, because I see a lot of, the prototypical patient is a perimenopausal woman looking to lose a little weight, and he lives in this household with a bunch of numbskulls who are just eating pizza and burgers, and they're not going to change. And so it's so hard It's so hard, but there's, you can fight that fight still.
I love that word, numbskull. I haven't heard that in a while because I probably would have a much worse
Well,
word for that.
I would never, of course, I would never call anybody that. I mean, there's tons of wonderful people who are eating the wrong food, but I'm being a little facetious.
So what advice can you give people when they're in an unclean environment? Because I, like you, I find that it doesn't guarantee that you'll fail in an unclean environment, but I sure haven't seen anybody not succeed in one.
Yeah, I mean, the environment's critical, and if people are bringing temptation in their life, they're just not gonna, it's not gonna work. So.
Yeah. It's interesting. I thought I knew everything about calorie density, but you said something that I never heard before, that ghrelin levels decrease when the energy density of the diet decreases. I did not know that.
Well, if you look at weight loss, so in general weight loss research, as people lose weight, you see ghrelin creep up, and it gets pretty high. And so you imagine after 6 months in this much higher ghrelin level, that's about 6 months is when people on typical low calorie programs commonly sort of say, "Oh God, I'm going to go off plan. I'm going to eat this other rich food," because the hunger becomes a little intolerable. But if you look at some of the longer, even 1 year research, certainly short-term research, if people are eating lower calorie density in some of that research, the ghrelin level doesn't go up in the same way. So it's not necessarily that it goes down, but it doesn't go up. And that suggests that, you're avoiding that biologic response to weight loss, which is the biologic response is eat more, eat more, eat more, eat more. So if you're avoiding that biologic response, boy, that's the sweet spot. That's really what you want to do.
Yeah, I did not know that. That's really interesting. And when you take two of your three, the legs of your stool, the choice and the amount, if you pair the whole food plant-based diet, especially one that is lower in energy density, you don't really have to worry as much about the amount, do you?
Right. You can't, it's very difficult. I tell people it's very difficult to overeat pinto beans, if you're not sticking a bunch of sugar and fat on them. It's very difficult. Now, so you can, these are kind of a seesaw kind of thing. Like if you eat foods that are higher calorie density, you're going to have to pay more attention to food amount. If you're eating foods way down on low calorie density, you can't overeat watermelon, or people think they can, but it's like 130 calories per pound. I mean, you have to eat 10 pounds of the stuff to eat, yeah, you can't overeat vegetables, that's for sure, to overeat calories. There are maybe some people who could, I suppose, overeat, potatoes and certainly the grains are probably a little bit easier, but it's pretty hard. So I don't think people need to worry about that to start. I mean, if you're really being strict about food choice, the other stuff kind of falls in line.
I think like you said, it's when you put sugar, oil, and salt on it, anything can be overeaten.
That's right. Anything can. You can overeat kale chips.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, where do you stand on sugar, oil, and salt?
So I think, a little bit of sweetener, personally, a little bit of sweetener is okay to start. And some salt is fine. I don't encourage people to cook with a lot of salt, but salting their food is fine. We need a little bit of salt. And if you look at some of the nutrient composition of some whole food plant-based diet plans, it actually might be a little low in salt, if anything, on some of them. So adding a little salt is okay in my mind. I know that's maybe a little different than the SOS free, but I think a little bit is fine. And a little bit of sweetener is fine. Now, if you want, it's all nutrition is a gradation, all nutrition is a continuum. So if you're a person with just absolutely miserable genetics, miserable predisposition, and goodness, you have the motivation to be extremely strict, and you absolutely want to go at the end of the spectrum in terms of the sledgehammer of efficacy, and you can do SOS free, great. It's probably better. So again, it's that spectrum of where you want to go and how strong you want to be. And it happens in my practice that SOS free is salt, oil, and sugar free is, for the general population, is a step too far for most people.
I would agree with you. It takes, and even for those that do it, it probably took them a long time to get to that level.
Yeah, I will say I'm pretty strict with oil, because oil is the most calorie dense. And boy, people can add, hundreds of calories and think that they barely use any oil. And so it really can muck up the system. So I will be very strict with added oil.
It's interesting about food structure because you hear a lot about intermittent fasting, and some of the people doing it in non-plant-based world, they've narrowed their feeding window, but they haven't changed their food at all. I mean, they're eating horrible foods.
Yeah. Yeah. If you look at some of those studies, it's funny. Research kind of wants to isolate these different factors. That's the way modern research works. You want to figure out the mechanism. So what is the factor that matters? So these research studies are kind of go out of their way, and some of them that I read to say that no nutritional guidance was provided. So, and that's the appeal of it, right? You can eat 6 hours a day, but I'm going to go have lunch at Burger King and get the burger and fries, and I'm going to have the pie from the grocery store after that. And boy, that sounds appealing, and yet it doesn't really work.
Yeah, thank you. As a medical doctor, in your opinion, do things like caffeine or alcohol have any effect on health and weight in particular?
Yeah, caffeine is a tricky one. I've looked up that because I wanted to write articles, and you'll find a million different things. If you look at coffee, for example, there's research showing that coffee drinking is linked to lower mortality, lower cancer risk. It is a bean juice, has a ton of antioxidants. In some places, that's by far the number one source of antioxidants is coffee. So, I'm not against coffee from a chronic disease point of view. I think the research is too murky to really honestly say coffee does X, something bad. I think because there's mixed research. I am against coffee though for another reason. One is that people get addicted to that stimulant at certain times in the morning, and probably a fair amount of that stimulant. And so it can do things like it can mess with sleep. It can mask a poor eating structure. So that person who wakes up and skips breakfast but has the cup of coffee, I think that's masking maybe some of their hunger. Still giving them pep, so they're not attuned to what their body needs. And people with GI problems like stomach issues, heartburn, definitely sleep problems or bladder problems. Coffee can exacerbate all of those. So, if you're driving a long way, you have a cup of coffee, or you have your special cup of coffee Saturday morning, I'm not going to tell anybody that's bad for their health at all. I think it's something to think about secondary. But if you're taking a proton pump inhibitor, if you're taking omeprazole or one of the other ones, pantoprazole, and you're drinking 2 cups of coffee every day, that you got to really think about stopping that.
Great, thank you.
And alcohol, let me say alcohol, finish your question. Alcohol, I'm against alcohol. Again, a rare drink, I would never, there's no research to say a rare drink is unhealthy, but if you look at alcohol consumption, alcohol consumption in excess is linked to cancer at just about every place in the body, in the GI tract it touches. Cancer of the upper GI tract, questionably of the stomach, cancer of the large bowel, cancer of the liver, potentially, and cancer of the breast after it's metabolized. So you're taking something where if you drink just a little too much, you have a higher risk of cancer. And you're thinking, well, how much can I get away with? And that's always just a dangerous proposition. And that doesn't even begin to touch on the horrible, horrible tragedy of alcohol misuse, the tragedy that results for so many people in addiction and so forth.
But in terms of caloric density, I would imagine also being a liquid calorie, it's not really favorable for weight loss.
Yeah, it depends how much you drink. If you, the alcohol itself, it's hard to say. I remember reading a study where people who drank in a social way ended up eating more. So it's not so much just the alcohol, but you can imagine you're sitting there having a beer, you're going to have more of the chips or whatever it's in front, the snacks in front of you. That's not going to help you at all. If you drink enough in an alcoholic sort of way, you can actually lose weight. It starts replacing your food calories. But so you get these studies that show alcohol has a mixed effect. But my impression is probably that moderate, regular drinking is not good for your weight.
You mentioned gut health earlier, and a lot of people say they have trouble with a plant-based diet because they get bloated. They just have trouble embracing it at the beginning.
Yeah, I think people have, many people have the wrong bacteria for this type of diet, and that's not a surprise. I mean, if you've been eating a typical American diet and suddenly you stick a whole bunch of fiber in there and there's very little bacteria to manage that fiber, or in converse, the bacteria starts flourishing and suddenly you have this huge increase of gas and so forth, it's going to give you symptoms. Now, there's a couple different things about that. The initial change is usually transient. So if you have some mild gut symptoms, a little bit of bloating, a little bit of gas, that usually gets better with time. And at least the uncomfortable, problematic parts of that usually get better with time as your gut system changes. On the more extreme end, there's people with IBD, like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and who may find that these things really are triggering for some more severe symptoms, beans and fiber and stuff. And so sometimes you have to work around that, and that's not something that you would necessarily just keep pushing through.
Right. What's your take on food addiction and emotional eating?
So I think food addiction is, you can get pretty academic in terms of what technically is an addiction and not, and I kind of stay away from that in terms of saying, yes, meets all the criteria for addiction. It's very clear to me, though, from a practical point of view, working at the ground level with people, that sugar and fat have addictive properties. And the research supports that. So if you have a little bit, for example, you want more. If you get habituated to small amounts, you need higher and higher amounts to get the same effect. In some research studies, they've demonstrated some withdrawal symptoms if you're eating a lot of this stuff and you actually just quit cold turkey. So there are addictive properties that are consistent with addiction, with addiction with these foods. And, basically, you want more. It's that little hit of pleasure. I call it the drug-like effect of food. You eat food for nourishment and for satiation and being full. But in our modern food environment, we also eat for that drug-like effect, for that entertainment, for that pleasure. And those foods are highly processed to maximize that drug-like effect. And it has the same type of biologic behavior from other drugs that you might imagine.
Right. Thank you. You mentioned the typical patient that sees you for weight loss, and I'm guessing that's not their first time that they've sought help for weight loss. What do you say to them if they're about to give up hope that they could ever lose weight?
Well, realize that the difficulty of this is real, and it's very hard. And people oftentimes, usually, have many attempts at weight loss. That being true, this oftentimes is a new approach that people have not tried. And so just because other things haven't worked is not a reason to abandon every approach. And I've had people who have struggled, and it's incredibly emotional. It's incredibly difficult. A major aspect of their life and their self-esteem and everything. And it's so hard, to sometimes get up and try again. It's so hard. And people explain that to me. And but at the same time, I think it's worth it if the motivation is there. Now, there are times when I talk to people and it's just been such a habit to keep working at this. And there is a part of them intellectually that wants to lose weight, but it's almost like their motivation just isn't quite there. And they're kind of just fatigued at the whole effort. And you got to recognize that too. If the motivation isn't there, it's pretty hard. But if your motivation is there, go for it. Go try it try something else. Even if it's the 10th time, go for it.
Right. Don't give up. Dr. Campbell, what's the real truth about weight loss?
Well, I think the food choices are foundational. nobody really wants to talk about it. The dieting industry is filled with messages of eat, you can eat whatever you want to and just do our thing and you'll have success. And the real truth is that you can't. It's not marketable. It's not a money-making proposition, but the truth of weight loss is that you have to probably eat less or none of your favorite foods. You have to go out to restaurants less than you'd like to, and you have to pay attention to food amount and eating structure and change your entire environment and the relationships and those things in that environment. That is a hard thing to do. If you can do it, it gets easier fast. But it's hard initially. And the thing about weight loss that you'll never hear from the mainstream ideas and weight loss programs and products and so forth is exactly that. Instead, you will hear, messages of moderation and just do this and that type of thing. So the real truth is you got to do some hard stuff for real results.
Right. So if I understand you, it's difficult, but it can get easier, and maybe people can find new favorite foods.
Yeah, I think the one thing about this, if you look at all that low calorie stuff, in some ways it's appealing because you can eat your favorite foods and just have a little less. And gosh, that sounds kind of easy. I could still have my cheesecake. The thing is that hard work of eating less, it never gets better. It never goes away. And you will get tired of that, and most people give up. This approach is very different in that it is in some ways harder because you're changing your habits, changing your taste, changing your food environment. And that's really hard to do at first. But after that, you're not dealing with chronic hunger. You're eating until you're comfortably full and eating when you want to and so forth. And so you're not dealing with chronic hunger. It's not a diet. You're just doing things differently. And if you can get to that point, I think maintenance is really where this shines.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell.
You're welcome. Thank you.